You're listening to the Deerfield Public Library Podcast, October 21st, 2021.
I'd like to be daunted and pummeled and eviscerated by the end of an experience. My favorite art does that to me.
Welcome to the Deerfield Public Library Podcast, where we feature conversations with authors, artists, and other notable people from Chicagoland and around the world. I'm your host, Dylan Zavagno, Adult Services Coordinator at the library. Our guest this month is the poet Lisa Hiton, whose debut full-length book of poems came out this month. It's called Afterfeast, and it was selected as the winner of the Dorset Prize by Mary Jo Bang and published by Tupelo Press. Past listeners of this podcast will remember Lisa Hiton, who grew up here in Deerfield, as my collaborator on our Queer Poem a Day series. You can check out Queer Poem a Day here on this podcast feed or at deerfieldlibrary.org/queerpoemaday. It's really an honor to talk to Lisa and celebrate her own work after she helped us celebrate the work of so many other poets. We'll also be hosting Lisa here at the library for a reading from Afterfeast on Saturday, November 13th, 1 p.m. Central. It's a hybrid program you can choose to attend in person or online through Zoom. A link to sign up is in the show notes. Here's my conversation with my friend, Lisa Hiton. Lisa, welcome. I just want to say that I'm very daunted to speak with you, and that's partly because we are friends and collaborators, and it's also because the voice in this book has such a swagger and ambivalent comfortability, I think, with the dark power that a poetic voice can have, that I find it daunting to talk about, even sometimes frightening. And I thought that maybe we would just start with having you read a poem. And I thought we would start with There Was an Entire Chicken, which is the title. And like many poems, it takes as its setting Greece and the sea. And I think I'd just like you to start by reading it.
Absolutely. There was an entire chicken, one from the spit where I watched them spinning in the window while I waited for you to go to the bathroom. A family with 4 young children assessed the chickens, skin throbbing over the burnt organs. I thought the father was with his mistress, though I couldn't say why, nor could I decipher the Greek volleying around the chickens on my mind all the way to the coast. Potos is crowded. On the beach walk, there are many bodies. There are no jobs. There is no money. There are only beaches. We walk along the smutty shops lining the 2 streets of Potos. The sun blares down. I almost unbury it on a hot day in front of everyone. I'd be the chicken on the spit. I'd be long dead and burned. I'd be daylight. One cannot escape her sins, only survive them. We arrive late to the table. I don't know what Harry or Carolyn were thinking, where they were before, which of them ordered the chicken. The chicken, as in love, is devoured.
So, Lisa, this poem, I take it to be about the discovery of the possibility that one can speak in a poetic voice and coming to terms with the kind of bravery of entering that table of not being chicken. Am I onto something here?
It's fascinating because playing chicken was so not in my mind when I lived the moment of this poem, and even when I sat down to write it. But it is something that when I put the book together, multiple of my readers made comments about that I think helped me edit the poem. I think that entering the table and talking about it, talking about what you might be brave enough to do as a poet, is absolutely what is on what I would call the horizontal or earthly axis of this poem. Carolyn and Harry are the poet Carolyn Forche and her husband, the photographer Harry Madison. The you in the poem is the great poet of my peer group, Lauren Clark. So there's a way that the actual presence of poets and in Hebrew, poet and prophet are the same word. I think of Carolyn Forche often when I have that memory about that word. So on the one hand, yes, I think that is absolutely what the speaking body is beginning to dabble with. I also think that poetry is the place that is a metaphysical, safe space to reckon with other darker things that we might not be willing to say aloud or in print. And I think that the balance between what's really going on between the ground and God versus what's actually happening, which is coming to a table and eating a whole chicken together. Those things are all at play in the stakes in the poem.
It's always amazing to me talking to you, Lisa, how quickly you can get into the depths and the heights, that vertical access with the poem. I thought I maybe would have you read the very first poem in the collection. And I wanted to sort of ask, which maybe you can answer before you read the poem or after you read the poem, how this figure that appears in the poetry of the non-lover, that you even use this phrase non-lover several times in the collection. And it strikes me as very unique as discovering that category, writing to that non-lover or discovering that category within yourself even. You can either read the poem pastoral or respond to that first.
I think I'll read the poem first. I think that makes more sense in the context. This is the proem. It's the poem before the book, which is another element of playing with poetics and narrative. It's a way of not having a beginning by having something before a beginning. Pastoral. It doesn't have to be something that happened to us for me to write it. Finally, I have to arrive in the field of what is unsaid, and I'm in it now, arrived there as though it were a memory, which is not the same as being in a body. Unreal in one sense, real in another. When we were children, the autonomy of falling asleep near each other presented itself to me as insidious, as squinting in dim light to rack the focus and switch what is sharp. I thought I wanted a sister. What I wanted was a lover. The poems and the impulses of a young person from my generation and all of my intersections know before the body does what's going on. This is a poem that understands the non-lover is going to become a large category for the overriding speaker. And all of this is the way that art makes something out of the realities of a person's life. For me, that was not quite knowing what my queerness was, that it was something that had different consequences than being an artist. Artist was an easy identity to wear, lesbian, less so. And I think that's even truer for the women who courted me or who I participated in romantic engagements with that ended with their straightness. So I think that to have this poem open the book, there's a few things. It's a pastoral, but it's not a real field. It's the field of the mind.
Right,
there's a way that gives a kind of freedom back to the self and to the overriding speaker throughout the whole book. And I think in the end, I didn't plan it when I wrote it. I didn't know this would be the first poem in a book, but I think that that's why the category of non-lover becomes the abstraction that the speaker has to figure out how to either turn or do away with, turn to or turn from throughout the book.
It's astonishing. And I was wondering when this poem was written, because it does affect all of the other poems so deeply.
I think it's strange that it's easier for me to remember. This is one of the first poems I wrote in Jory Graham's workshop in very early 2013. And part of why I know that is because one of the things my time with Jory taught me was about how to use physics, the metaphysical, and abstraction while still maintaining the rhetorical logic that was inherent to me, and just using intellect as something that was also sensory. And I think that this poem really captures something that I didn't do or know to do, or no poems could do prior to my time in her workshop.
Oh my gosh. Well, what I find so amazing about what's happening in this poem and what happens in many of these poems is the claiming of that space, of the space of poetry, of the space of there not being a body. And that also terrifies me. Have you learned to be less scared of that in writing it?
Less scared of having a body or not having one?
Both.
I think there is a problematic in my real life. I'm certain I've got the number of a good therapist who I'm sure could talk about this someday. I think it's problematic to not want or participate in the body, but I think it is a very under-discussed, normal, usual occurrence for the queer body. I think there are ways that we get so used to doing certain things, we don't even know that there's a level of repression that is constant and is like a fish being in water. So to me, that's something that in my day-to-day life, I probably have some hiccups or struggles with. I would way prefer to be in my head all day and to hang out in art spaces than I would to recognize the body and participate in the body. So I think for me, it's sort of the opposite problem. I think it maybe doesn't scare me enough. But I do imagine, and I think based on newer work that seems to be being written, that it won't be the same preoccupation in the future. I think that this time in my life and this time in writing poems is definitely preoccupied with it. A better reviewer would know if the book has an answer to what happens to the speaker and the body by the end. I'm not sure I know.
And I'm not sure I know either, but I do find it thrilling how willing you are to go into that ambivalence. And I think this is the perfect time to read Lethargy.
Great. Lethargy. I am ill with history, with watching it happen and not belonging to it. In the efforts of lesbianism, I have fallen asleep. Light through windows leaves your face, reflecting what I'm sure I will die of back at me. A magnifying glass over the smooth, hard body in which I cannot exit. We act like lovers as if the manners of coming into existence drop over us again and again like water. And even though we are hard bodies, the water, we know, means never having foot to ground. I know this. The light does not break through the casing, yet I wait for its violence. I tell myself I want a lover. I want a lover.
That last couplet at the end, where you're overhearing yourself, convincing yourself again of that category of non-lover, which suggests the possibility of a lover, is so startling to me. Can you tell us anything about how this poem came about?
Well, the cheat is if you know the older version, which ended, I tell myself I want a lover, parentheses, I want a lover, line break, what I wanted was a sister. It was like an inversion of that earlier poem that I read, Pastoral. I think that part of what happened, I will also say that the noticing what you just noticed and my revision came directly from Maggie Dietz. She's a great reader, and she really said some things and illuminated why this ending was the right one. And part of it is what you just noticed, that to tell yourself you want a lover, to have to convince yourself that the habits and rituals of being in a relationship, of monogamy, of being a lesbian, which is shrouded in so many non-sexy things, right? It's so opposite of gay male culture, right? It's like a Subaru and a U-Haul and forever and never dating people and cats and cottagecore, all of these sort of things that are just, they problematically place women with bodies like this into a particular stereotype that is inflexible. And I think that's part of what being in a relationship is that at some point you get lethargic about it. Things become inflexible and non-moving. And you have to convince yourself that you still love that person or that you want to be in this kind of relationship. And I think part of the struggle that this overriding speaker feels is wanting to participate and be seen in some way. There's a way that the speaker is always either hyper visible in the wrong way or hyper invisible to the people that the speaker wants to be seen by. And I think that the end of this poem and the opening of this poem deal with that in ways that are systemic, that history doesn't see women at all, let alone lesbians, that women obsess about how to correct things and care for people who are not even seeing them. That's sort of all happening at the beginning. And it ends with this mundane thing of trying to convince yourself that you want a lover. I think also the very last line, I want a lover, it's two things. It's that telling yourself, trying to convince yourself, but it's also finally saying it out loud that you actually do want a lover, that you have a body, that you have needs and desires and impulses. And so I'm glad that the multiplicity is there to your ears too.
Oh, absolutely. And it's several times, I think, and I keep wanting to call it the swagger of your voice, that happens in a repetition, a kind of doubling down of what's been propositioned as theory, and then saying, no, I do really mean this, and I mean it even more. And I really just love these poems. So can we hear another one? I thought maybe we would hear the title poem, Afterfeast, and you could tell us where that title came from and what an afterfeast is.
Sure. When I spent multiple summers on the island of Thasos and in the second largest city on the mainland of Greece called Thessaloniki. My mother is a Sephardic Jew, and her father's side, their last port of entry on their way to the States is Thessaloniki. I always say last port of entry because the kind of the standing joke on her side of the family is that Grandpa Reuben, if you asked him where he was from, he would shrug. He spoke Ladino, so neither the Turks nor Greeks would claim him. But also, the food he ate was Greek, the hash he smoked was Turkish. That's sort of the joke in the family. The second summer I was on Thasos, it happened that the Pentecost fell during June while I was on this island staying at a pension. And the poet Lauren Clark and I were living in the same room together. And Lauren and I came sort of down the stairs to the patio, and the tables were set in this beautiful horseshoe. And the staff kindly told us to get lost because it was the Afterfeast. So Lauren and I, that summer in particular, always wrote sort of sibling poems. So Lauren has a very different kind of Afterfeast poem. For me, what was so fascinating is that it's the Greek Orthodox Church follows the lunar calendar because they respect so many of the ways things fell in the Old Testament. The Afterfeast in the Old Testament is Shavuot, which was my bat mitzvah. It is one of the actual, we don't talk about this in the States, it's actually one of the, if not the most important holiday in a certain way, because it's when the Jews actually receive the Torah. And during Shavuot, which is the Feast of Weeks, you have this period of being freed from Egypt and given the Torah, and it's an after feast. There's olives and dates and pomegranates and cheese and music. And one of the rules for people who practice is that you stay up all night to read and study Torah. And as a night owl, this really spoke to me in every single way humanly possible. I think I'll read the poem now, and everything I just said is not really present in the poem. What is present in the poem are all these sort of almost campy things that you do when you're in a new culture to sort of participate and feel more like a traveler than a tourist, especially when you're living there for an extended time. So this takes some of the games of the island and makes their own after feast of them. After feast. There is a deep sea fish with 2 stones in its head. If you only find 1 stone, you've killed the fish too soon. You'll be doomed to 7 years of bad sex. When you eat the fish, if you find both stones, run them under cold water with the lemons. At night, make a fire at the sea's edge. The stone you throw in the fire will kill the thing it represents. The stone you throw in the water is the thing you'll seek all your life. What the stones stand for has to do with the fish you ate. In one case, the stones stand for 2 horribly obvious things: love between women and Judaism. You can't know which stone is which. You can only know by the fate that comes after. Because you're a bad gambler, you won't sleep tonight. If you shatter them, it will be up to the wind. Throw both in the fire, you'll be a hollow corpse. Throw both in the water, you'll live forever like this. The day dawns, the bread rises. You were so beautiful. Why couldn't you be brave?
Lisa, I know we've spoken when we were putting together year 1 of Queer Poem a Day about the kind of tension between going into identity politics, but also kind of trying to pull back to have this larger conversation about the contributions that queer people make to the world of literature. And here you're sort of wrestling, you know, as you say, horribly obviously, with these 2 category labels. Could you speak about that? And because it seems like this poem knows something more about that than previous conversations we've had.
I think that this poem announces something really loudly, which you just pointed to, the 2 horribly obvious things. It is my least favorite line in probably the whole book, if not the poem. I tried for years to eradicate naming them in a way that was so on the nose, right? Love between women became a much more universal, beautiful thing to say, and Judaism is just always Judaism. Faith never quite was right. So I kind of had to say that one as it was. But I think that where the poem stands in the book, I hope, does something that elaborates what identity politics sometimes do, which is to say that this is a book about being belated to history, to the world, to the body, to sexuality. That's the real afterfeast. There's an entire way that if you are queer, especially if you are a lesbian of whatever my intersections are at a given moment in time, the fate that you face is being belated. That is something that is a self-reckoning, and it's something that has to do with not being woven into the fabric of society, let alone of history, looking back. So I think the quieter thing I hope the poem does, especially where it's placed in the book and that it's the title poem, is that there's a way every poem in the book is about being belated, and every poem in the book could have carried this title. I hope other readers who are sharp consider that as one of the measures of how this book was made. As for larger identity politics in our contemporary literary moment, there are ways that the way identity politics have just entered our broad vernacular. It's something that I hear my students talk about. It's something that I hear parents struggling to say correctly certain things, but they're trying, right? There's a way that it's already in the rhetoric that's very exciting. I do hope that, and I think this is true too, the art made in this time, I think the art that acknowledges the identity politics, but writes from the real predicament of being in them instead of summarizing what it feels like or summarizing what that situation or predicament is. Those tend to be the pieces of art, I think, that have a different kind of power in the discourse and shaping how we can continue to use them and elaborate on them in art and in life. So I don't know if this poem quite lived up to that task, but that is my hope. And that's been my hope in our conversations more broadly when we talk about, especially in our work together for Queer Poem a Day, someone who's sort of anti-identity politics as a project. I think that they're really important to look at when we gather things together and think about our social and historic moment.
I must hear, and you'll have to tell me how to say the title, Mise en Abyme.
Mise en Abyme.
And what is a mise en abyme?
A mise en abyme is a visual physics phenomenon. It's similar to fractals, but it's more specific. It is, you'll appreciate this as a Midwesterner, it is like looking at a Land O'Lakes butter box, and the woman on the box is sitting cross-legged, and in her hand she's holding a Land O'Lakes butter box. And if you look at that one in the Land O'Lakes butter box that's in her hand, there she is holding Land O'Lakes butter, and so on and so forth into infinity. It's that mirror facing a mirror phenomenon. Everything will be the same no matter how far in you go. It's like the larger set of a multiple set of infinity. Woman on the butter, the shapes that are made mimic each other. And being in a place like Greece and all of a sudden having the elements hit you, the heat of the midday, the way things feel against the skin, the exhaustion, those sort of lend themselves to a very different kind of spiritual and erotic day-to-day experience when you are looking at this landscape that you know you're going to have to leave at some point. Mise en Abyme. While the others clustered in the inkwell of shade made by a beach umbrella, we walked the edge of the peninsula just past the marble quarry. The vast white slabs burned in the midday heat, burned at our feet. The crevices and indentations that had just cradled tatters of waves now dried and densely filled with salt, ancient salt, scouring our calluses. At the edge, I immersed myself in the blue. Because the sky was cloudless, I couldn't be sure which element drenched my skin. Unbearable organ. The water, then the slab. Immersion, then pain. Immersion, pain, and what had I desired, and what had I seen? No stone in my periphery. No ships in the timeless clarity before me, the blue spilling into itself and back, and a voice speaking. It began as hers, calling out to Alexander, to his treasure in the centuries hollowed drumlin below us. Then it morphed and hid in the shade, the same shape and color as the shade of the umbrella, made by the creature shaped like an umbrella, its hood hollow. Is that the head or the heart of the thing? and therefore made of shade, structured to cradle that dark mystery, voice, blotting itself until it dissolved as everything else into the invisible crease of blue, only to return to me as myself without a body. Immersion, then pain. On the hot slab of history, I survived, and the creature below me collected its things in the shade of it.
I find this poem to be such a major statement. And I want to ask so many questions about it. You can see the idea of writing out of a predicament that you've talked to me about before, where the voice in its speaking is discovering its limits. Immersion into the voice of the poem, then pain, immersion, pain. And I'm wondering in what ways this poem, which I think I take to be in part being stung by a jellyfish, is also about the kind of ars poetica pain of writing at all.
Yes, the poem, the creature is an octopus, I will say.
Oh, an octopus.
Its hood hollow and filled with ink. That's the octopus.
Yes, yes.
And a few things. I think this poem so well didn't know it was going to be an ars poetica. It was so much about some of those sensory things that happen in this place that if I describe to you sounds like fiction. Thasos is an island in Greece that is so far north. You can see Mount Athos and Turkey from the island. There's all of this mythology about how Alexander's treasure is buried in some triangulated form between Mount Athos and Turkey, and the thing in the triangle is Thasos. So people really do think Alexander's treasure is somewhere on that island. So I think there's this whole way that when also at this time of year in Greece, nobody is out and about after lunch. It is way too sweltering hot. And there I was laying on what's left of the marble from this area where all of it's been taken. Thasian marble is, I think, the second most sought after, second to Italy. So all this marble is gone, but there's still slabs of it there, and they're just scratching at you because it's so hot and all the water from the earlier tide is just salt now. So I think part of it is just trying to capture this sensory thing and how the self wants to be immersed at all times and how it's painful. And that is in art, that is in, I think for me, the body itself, which is hard to disentangle from coming out and coming of age in whatever belated fashion I was doing that while I was in Thasos. The Ars Poetica came later. I think also this poem for me has a anxiety of influence from At the Fish Houses. There's a way that
I was going to say this is your Elizabeth Bishop poem.
I mean, I wish. I don't think anyone can ever do that, not what At the Fish Houses does, but I do think there's some ghost of what was happening that was cold over there that was, bearable to no mortal. I think Unbearable Organ is what's left of my homage and my sort of shrinking at the anxiety of the influence of that poem. So yeah, I'm not sure if that answers anything about Ars Poetica, but I hope like a good Ars Poetica, because it doesn't know that that's what it's doing, that that's what the water is doing, and that's what the cycle of this spot on the island is. And that the octopus, who is akin to me in so many ways, but the octopus is filled with ink instead of, I mean, I know it's not really true, but in our mythos, right? Like it's this thing filled with ink instead of with organs, which I love. That's art instead of body. And it appears and it disappears into its own ink, and it collects things and rearranges them in its den. That is very true. That's something I also do. And so I think that knowing something like that could live in this hollowed out quarry and in this hollowed out peninsula for however many years, but really over however many centuries that the octopus lives, is part of the lineage that I want to claim and be claimed by. And it's one that doesn't have some of the consequences, the usual consequences of being claimed by society or history. I also think that's part of what poems do that's unique to any other art form. We kind of don't ever belong in our time for a reason, because we meaning like whatever the pages are, they see and they know too much, too precisely, in too many ways that are self-effacing to a society. So they just sort of get buried in the inkwell with everything else.
Well, that is exactly what's so amazing and daunting to me about talking about these poems. The idea of the creature blotting itself until it dissolved as everything else into the invisible crease of blue, only to return to me, suggests that there is something about ourselves that appears in the poems that is always disappearing. Something about central to our identities that is always about fleeing from history, from ourselves, and from each other. I'm just very moved by it, and I thought I would have you read from a later section in the book, which starts to take on some personas from Jewish European history, of course, particularly the Holocaust. And this is a poem called Sodomite.
Sodomite. What is fastened by the lover to the body, then fortified by having been fastened to. Be copious, be deep. And can this have been between only men, or could they be women, or have been feminine? Imagine the world to be this too. Copious, deep water, just like a great lie, still on the top when riling beneath, and heaving at the tide change when, below the surface, static, mundane, non-love, unmoving murk of post-rain. We had once been yoked, exacting, platonic, never ending in action, though below us, copious amounts of igneous rock fortified, so one could walk through the water in whatsoever form it may take, intrusive body, that Pluton-lined orb, divined for even the righteous, whosoever, by what term, fasten themselves to anyone else by design.
Lisa, please tell me about this poem, because I find it very moving about, in my reading, how this kind of, taking on a label or somebody else labeling you a sodomite, it just becomes such a dangerous act. And at the same time, there's an ambivalence there, because it can become our way of speaking about ourselves. How did this poem come about?
This poem, I hate to admit, this poem was very originally me having a conversation in my early queerness with another early queer person about sex toys. And I honestly was just thinking about the way that the stakes change once the door closes, and how, as you mentioned in the question, Dylan, we have so many categories and labels that are horrifying and problematic, especially historically. The one sodomite is very, very scary. And, even in the States, not till the 80s were some of the laws against sodomy eradicated.
2003 in Texas.
2003 in Texas. Oh, to no surprise. Yikes. So I think part of what I was thinking about is just the ways that the body has to express things and the ways that humans add things to our bodies as part of our expression sometimes. And to what extent is it natural, and to what extent is it by design, as the poem says in the end? So I think that there's a way that we fasten ourselves to some of those labels, or against them to other labels, to avoid being called certain things. But we also fasten ourselves to each other, and that's literal and metaphysical. And so from whatever that conversation I was having that seemed to be silly, this very serious poem came to be. That's the best I can offer.
Well, it's amazing because it is in this section of these poems at the end that really relate directly to the Holocaust and to, a labeling campaign that is purely destructive.
I will say this poem also directly follows. It's interesting that you said that take on persona. I don't know. I wasn't thinking of sodomite as being persona, but the poem prior, Bakery, is certainly a persona poem where I imagine, and the imagining is very literal. My very dear friend, the brilliant poet Richie Hoffman, has the opposite intersection of me. He is a German American. He lived in Germany as a young boy. He is not Jewish. And we went to this little medieval town, Speyer, outside of Frankfurt together, and had these sort of opposite senses of dislocation. So the poem prior to Sodomite is called Bakery, where we actually went to the bakery that his family once ran. And I had this other vision of if this were a different time period, walking up to this bakery, and I'm, his Jewish friend, but the Holocaust is beginning. Here he is at the bakery giving me away to the Gestapo. There's like a whole other actual sodomy that occurs in the poem prior. And I think, as you mentioned earlier, I didn't notice that I do this, but there's a way that there's the theoretical and then there's the doubling down with very real examples. And I think those two poems next to each other, I think sort of battle each other the way magnets might if you face them backwards.
Wow. Well, I was hoping that we would end actually with the poem that follows Sodomite. This is one of the long poems, and there are several long poems that I'm sorry we don't have time to read. I love the poem, The Space Between Trees, where you say we hold on to things because we think proximity to the world makes us a part of it. And one thing I learn, I believe, from your poems is that we are not part of this world and we were not meant to be. And I was hoping we would end with Dislocated Cities, if you have the time.
Of course. Dislocated cities. In the synagogue ruins, we stand on opposite sides of a rock window, natural as 11th century figures, still acquainted with each other, as though no history had happened through the rock lung. You do not hear my sigh, exhale, when you inhale and think, yes, Miriam, my skin matted out by the sun, dusty pearl, matching the ruins we look through to each other. A sign says verboten, because it is the language of your ancestors, you obey. This is not the language of my ancestors, though there are Jews who came from here. We have never been lovers. After the beer garden, after the river drowning itself in the river, after the long stroll through the Rhine alley, music in the vast cathedral, air from the crypt below rising, centuries old, like the groundwater below the synagogue ruins just across the plaza. Judengasse abandoned. The cathedral where we are among a listening crowd. Pain on the edges of my body, though bodies do not have edges but are abstract and rounded. The helix of music is the helix of genetics, exhausting me but waking you up. It is so cold here. I cannot cry for how numb I am. down to the breast. We will never be lovers. On the stone path leading to our pension, a gravestone, Hebrew carved in by German peasants. They mimicked the shapes but could not read, the names being written. Another stone left unturned, I cannot turn over. Another story where the protagonist disappears without a sound. Twin beds in our room bumped next to each other. I am cold and sleep right away. In the morning, you are awake, pacing. The news in German, the Rhine still spilling into itself. Where everywhere else I dream, here nothing. For breakfast, coffee, sausages, a soft-boiled egg. We'll find the bakeries your family ran before there was a war to feel close to. You walk ahead of me into the Grand Cathedral. With my kino eye, I recognize everyone looks like you, medieval and contemporary at once. We stop for tea on the boulevard leading up to the Imperial Clock. Across the way, 3 street musicians, clarinet, accordion, tambourine, the tune I know from the Hebrew, at once medieval and contemporary, at once a peasantry, next to the croon of the regal country. It was the summer of Wagner in the country of your ancestors. You stand before the buildings that were once run by your family. You ask me to take your photograph. When I shoot through the glass column, the lens flare, the light so bright I see black and white, like the photos you've brought from the century before, which you folded and put in your notebook, boyish thing that you are. If we are far, the war is far. If I am close to you, I am close to the war. I am in the one country where I have no affairs, where I do not feel love. When I had no love, I excused anxiety from the table and sent her to her room in the attic where she made no ruckus. But when I slept alone in the city of medieval air, I could hear beneath the ice sheets the low murmur of her slow typing. You can't get to Salonika without passing through. In the last city Reuben lived in Europe, I feel present instead of historic. People look like him, like my mother, olive skin and coarse hair. I ask where the right stones are. I look for plaques to read. I pace in and out of the hours. The plaza where they burn the bodies like banned books. The museum tucked in the maze of Salonika. Hide my face when I weep sitting on the marble bench. You would hide me. You would hide me. You would hide me if we were in a different time. No one in my family survived the Holocaust. Everyone in my family survived the Holocaust, though none is a Holocaust survivor. Where were you when the winds changed, when you knew he would never be Greek or Turk, because he was something else, without a nationality, but with a race, threaded, thin as fishing line all over Europe and heading west? Was it in the Schwitz house next to the Greek Orthodox Church? Was it in a letter from the state, a glance from his blacksmith, a season of lemons that stayed green, a lightning storm on the coast of the city where so many bolts hit at once I had to believe in Poseidon? Was this town Greek or Turkish when he left? Was he a Turkish boy? Were there poplars to swing from in the yard? Greco, Turkish, Judeo, Spanish, Yiddish, Hebrew, English, hide. Below deck, barrels of olive oil until you get to port. Hide your face, speak in Greek. When they offer ouzo, ask for 1 ice cube. When they offer yogurt in the morning and they've already brought ham and bread, say Efkaristo. You can't leave Salonika without passing through. You can't go back to America without passing through.
What else would you like to say to our listeners?
It's hard. I can't decide if reading Dislocated Cities made me want to say more about Dislocated Cities. I'm not sure. Did you like the book? That's like the real thing I want to know.
I loved the book. I read it 4 times. I was reading it in the bath last night. And I really am so blown away, and I do want to keep using the word daunted by your fierce intelligence and your ability to enact that on the page and dramatize it and dramatize how, because I guess for me, and I'll probably cut this out, but for me, I think a lot of poets of our generation think that poetry is a nice thing. And I think that it's not. And I am really grateful for how much weight you give to the pain of poetry and its sort of immense power. Like when I read some of these poems, I have the feeling that I get when I read Proust, where the real world doesn't exist anymore, and the only world that's real is the world of the poem. And that is a thrilling feeling, and it's a terrifying feeling, and it's very seductive, right? It makes me want to only live in literature. But there are so many signposts in your work telling me that that's not possible either.
I love everything that you said, because I think, as you mentioned, there's a real, I'm not even sure per se that it's only our generation. I think there's cycles where so much of poetry, and also the perception of poetry, forget about within the world of poets. I think people come to poems often for beauty, for balance, for altruism, for transcendence. Those things have their place. So does pain. And almost all of the work I do as a teacher of art, in poetry, in fiction, and in film, revolves around a totally different value set. The course I taught this summer that I designed was called Little Daggers. The poem themes were mastery, revenge, self-portrait, persona. These are all things that are meant to be very conniving and very seductive, and they're meant to obliterate the time-space continuum, if not the reader's ability to find themselves until they exit the art entirely. And that sort of full immersion is something I'm unbelievably interested in. I think especially because my real background is film and theater, I am often thinking about how can, also I think so many poets don't often think about, maybe if they are poets who are interested in music, they think about how poems and time are related. But poems are, lyric poems especially, are time bound. There is a first line and a last line. And that is sort of the ultimate prowess of the genre to me. And what happens in that space and in that passing time before you get the absence and that quick rug pulled from you back to the white space of the page at the end is something that I do find terrifying, but also terrific. It has that ability to do something awestruck and to totally pummel you. I am thinking Proust is a great example. Woolf is a big influence for me in that way. The film The Master by P.T. Anderson, so much of Tarantino's work. These are like the other big influences of this kind of tone in the world. I also think it's really important to bear witness to the pain you've experienced, especially if you are a queer person who wasn't allowed to watch it or experience it because you were so repressed in the ways that you had to survive, that you didn't get these moments to look at it. So as much as there's a kind of niceness, I also will just say here in my very conniving way that nice in Latin is the root of ignorant. And so there is a real, I think, buried dogma or manifesto in my approach to poetics and to teaching poetics and to just thinking about art and the kind of art I love. In the ways that you say, I'd like to be daunted and pummeled and eviscerated by the end of an experience. And it's so rare. It's so very rare. And my favorite art does that to me over time. It's why, like, I think now Voyager is the best of Betty Davis, or I love that I sort of can't pick myself up off the couch anytime I read Beloved. Like that is what I want to leave people with, because I also think it's the only way that you change the paradigms of how you see things in the world, is to really challenge them.
I think, given all of that, I'm going to read you one more of your poems. I'll read a short one, The Lyre Bird. Tail plumes stretched like sharp swords, then recoiling. I followed it, thinking it was a kookaburra. With every inch I advanced, it changed its song. Unrecognizable cries, stolen from the throats of others, lyre, lyre bird. Holding still, the feathers like Byzantine paintings of snakes, can't fly. Foul in your originless body. You try to be everything and are therefore nothing. It wasn't about the trees being felled until you railed on as the chainsaw. And like Orpheus with the lyre, you faced your doom and sang into it.
I think to end with the lyre bird says a whole lot.
Yeah.
I also have to say this is a little embarrassing to admit, but I think that my own relationship with being a liar my whole life, something that ended up being much more related to hiding myself than I realized, has so much to do with the kind of art that I feel seen by and that I want to make. I think that when the veil lifts and when it doesn't, the role of disguise is so important in every thing that I love, in the Greek myths that I love, in all of Jeanette Winterson. I mean,
in Shakespeare.
In Shakespeare, right? Like I played, in high school, God bless Deerfield High School, especially Susan Gorman, our unbelievable theater director. When we did Shakespeare, I was Francis Flute. And in A Midsummer Night's Dream, Francis Flute is in the play within a play, and he plays Thisbe. So it's supposed to be a man playing a woman in a play within a play. So I'm like a woman playing a man playing a woman within a play within a play. And the way that the players had to construct like this other kind of backstory, because we weren't just a bunch of men in a Shakespearean company doing this, is so much the fun being in the weeds part of being a little liar. And also that art is a safe place to tell lies and to reveal that you've done that to your readers or to your audience. That is something that I think is an actual balm for me, as somebody who just for all kinds of reasons, gay and otherwise, only had a language for hiding. I think that this has been a safe space to bury some things and to unbury others and to play with it. So, Dylan, I am so grateful that you read this book and that you read it with such generosity and flexibility to be daunted and terrified. I think it's a tall ask also.
Well, it's my favorite thing too. I want to be that in art, so I'm really grateful for I'm grateful for all of our collaboration and friendship, but I'm really grateful for this book, and congratulations. You can find out more about Lisa Hiton at lisahiton.com or check out Afterfeast at the Deerfield Public Library. And come out for Lisa's live reading from Afterfeast Saturday, November 13th at 1 p.m. Central. Sign up to attend in person or over Zoom. As always, links will be in the show notes and our blog post. That's our show. Thank you to Lisa for taking the time to record our conversation, and thank you for listening to our 50th interview show. Comments and feedback are always welcome and can be sent to podcast at deerfieldlibrary.org. Go to deerfieldlibrary.org/podcast to learn more about our show and find links to subscribe. You can also follow the library on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or check out our YouTube channel. Links are on our website or in our show notes. We'll be back next month. Thanks for listening.